Elias had outlived everyone he loved, his wife, his daughter, even his friends, but through the years of quiet solitude, there was one constant companion who never left his side, Belle, the small goat with a silver bell around her neck. In a world that seemed to forget him, Belle always stayed, her soft bleats and gentle presence the only echoes of a life that once thrived. But now, as the years had worn down both man and animal, Elias knew the day was coming when neither the sound of her bell nor the warmth of her presence would fill the silence again. And when that day arrived, the valley would lose more than just an old man, and a goat it would lose the last of a love that had endured the slow passage of time. The day the disease came to the valley, Elias knew something was wrong before it even reached the goats. There had been whispers among the farmers in town, rumors carried by the wind that a sickness had spread across the hills. But nothing could prepare him for what he would find that morning when he went to check on his herd. God, it was late spring, a time when everything felt new, when life felt promised, even after all the years Elias had spent toiling away. The trees were in bloom, and the air held a sweet scent of fresh earth. But when Elias stepped into the barn that morning, the smell of sickness hit him before anything else. He didn't even have to get close to see it. His goats were already staggering, their legs weak, their heads drooping. Some lay still on the straw, their chests rising and falling with shallow breaths. Others struggled to stand but fell, their legs too weak to hold them. A sense of dread settled over him, cold and suffocating, as he crouched beside his favorite. Leela, a strong doe with a playful heart, but Leela didn't lift her head. Her breath was shallow, ragged, and her eyes were glazed over. Elias ran his hand along her side, feeling the heat radiating from her feverish body. His heart sank. "Not you too," he whispered. He tried to comfort her, but she barely responded. The disease had spread quickly, and before Elias could even consider what to do, the barn was filled with the sound of coughing, of wheezing, of the terrible rasp of animals struggling to breathe. It was like something out of a nightmare, too fast, too merciless. In the days that followed, one by one, his herd fell. Each day felt like a death in slow motion, his hands working tirelessly, but hopelessly, to save them. Nothing worked. The village vet said there was no cure. It was just a sickness that swept through and left nothing behind but emptiness. And so Elias watched as his goats, the creatures he'd raised for years, grew weaker and eventually succumbed. By the end of the week, only one remained, a small white kid, barely a few months old, who had been so young and fragile that Elias hadn't even noticed her at first. She had been too small to stand out among the older, stronger goats, but now she was the last dot when Elias found her. She was lying in the hay, looking up at him with wide, dark eyes, her little silver bell resting on her neck, the soft sound of it barely audible above the silence of the barn. "You made it," Elias murmured, kneeling beside her. His hand shook as he reached out to touch the soft, fragile creature. She nudged his hand with her nose, bleating softly, the bell around. Her neck jingled faintly, as if calling out to him. He didn't know why she had survived when all the others had perished. She wasn't the strongest, wasn't the healthiest, but somehow she was still here, staring up at him with innocent eyes, trusting him. The realization hit him like a wave. She was all he had left. His heart felt like it was splitting in two. He sat down in the hay beside her and just stared at the barn around them. His farm, his home felt barren now, without the life of the herd. He didn't know what to do. There was no herd to care for. No crop to tend, no family to come visit. His daughter, Lucy, had left for the city years ago, and her visits had become fewer and fewer. His wife had passed away just a few seasons before, leaving him with only the land, his animals, and his memories, but now he had Belle. "You're all I have left, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Belle nuzzled against his side, the softness of her fur a small comfort. She didn't understand his words, but her presence, her warmth, was enough. She was here. And that was all that mattered now. For the first time in days, Elias felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of something like hope. He could care for Belle, he could keep her safe, and maybe, just maybe, she would keep him going that evening. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias tied a small, delicate bell around Belle's neck. It was silver and glinted in the fading light, the same bell his wife had once used for her favorite goat. That goat had died years ago, long before Belle had ever been born, but the bell remained, a symbol of what was lost. Belle, still small and trembling, stood quietly as Elias adjusted the bell. It was a quiet, ritualistic moment. In his heart, he felt something both bitter and beautiful. It was the grief of losing everything, of watching his world crumble. But it was also the tender connection of two souls, alone together, finding solace. In each other's company, Elias stood up slowly, wiping the tears that had gathered on his wrinkled cheeks. Belle looked up at him, her dark eyes wide and trusting, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elias allowed himself to smile. "You and me, Belle," he said softly. "We'll make it through this together." For the rest of the evening they sat together in the barn, the flickering light of a single lantern casting shadows across the straw. Belle curled up beside him, her bell ringing softly as she drifted to sleep, and Elias sat beside her, not minding the loneliness that still gnawed at his heart, for now he wasn't alone. And that was enough. The days passed slowly after the herds. Death, each one blending into the next like the fading colors of twilight. The farm, once a cacophony of bleating goats and the sound of plows cutting through the earth, was now strangely still. The wind would whistle through the empty barn, its hollow cry an eerie reminder of what had been lost. But in the quiet, there was Belle small and bright, a tiny flicker of life in a world that had grown dim. Elias found solace in her company. She became his shadow, following him wherever he went, whether it was tending to the garden or checking the fences that had once held a dozen goats. She was always there, trotting beside him with a soft jingle of her bell, her steps light and quick, as though she carried the weight of his sorrow with a grace he could never understand. Elias often wondered if she realized how important she was. To him, she was everything. She was the last reminder of a life he had once known, a life full of movement, of chatter, of family. Now she was his companion, his caretaker in a way. In the mornings, Elias would make tea in the small kitchen, and Belle would stand by the door, watching him with those curious, intelligent eyes. He would smile at her, the morning light catching the silver bell around her neck, and say, "Not yet, Belle, you'll have to wait." And wait she did. When he finally poured his tea, he'd go outside and sit on the porch, his weathered hands cradling the warm mug as Belle curled up at his feet. The sun would creep up over the valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Elias would watch the horizon, his thoughts a swirl of memories and regrets. "Lucy," he would whisper, though he knew no one would hear, "I hope you're happy wherever you are." There were days when he would write to her, letters filled with hope and longing. He would tell her how the farm was doing, how he missed her, how he wished she would come home. But after a few years of no replies, he had stopped sending them. The mailbox had become just another piece of forgotten machinery on the property, rusted and silent. Belle never judged him for his silences. Instead, she would nuzzle against his leg, her bell ringing softly, and he would feel a strange peace settle over him. She never asked him for anything except, perhaps, a bit of grain or a scratch behind the ears, but in return, she gave him something far more precious. Presence. Elias found it in the little things. The way Belle would follow him through the fields, her coat gleaming in the sunlight. The way she'd trot to the well with him and stand quietly while he lowered the bucket, her eyes watching his every move. When he was alone at the dinner table, Belle would sit nearby, her gaze steady, as though she, too, was waiting for him to say the words he often left unsaid. She would sleep beside him by the fire each night, curling up in the warmth of the hearth. There were evenings when Elias would look down at her and feel the weight of his loneliness lift just enough to breathe. It was in those moments, when the only sound was the crackling of the fire and Belle's soft snoring, that Elias would close his eyes and let the tears fall, just a few quiet ones. Belle never asked why. She simply rested her head on his knee and stayed. It was a particularly bitter winter when Elias began to feel the weight of his age. His hands, once strong and sure, had started to tremble, and his back ached more than it ever had before. The seasons were passing faster than he could keep up with, and there were days when he found himself lost in the rhythm of his memories, forgetting the present entirely. Belle seemed to notice. She would often stand by his side, as though guarding him, watching him with that silent wisdom that always surprised him. If he stumbled or struggled with something, whether it was lifting a bucket or clearing the path, she would be there, steady and sure, as if to say, "I've got you." One morning, after a heavy snowfall, Elias found himself outside in the barn, shoveling the walkway to the goat pen. The snow was deep, the air crisp and biting, but Belle was by his side, as always. She trotted through the snowdrifts with ease, her small hooves leaving a trail behind her, while Elias struggled, the cold seeping into his bones. "You're young." "Belle," Elias muttered, pausing to catch his breath. "I remember when I was that quick." Belle stopped, turning to face him. Her bell jingled faintly in the still air. Elias chuckled softly, a bitter sound that escaped his lips before he could stop it. "You're my last companion, aren't you? The last bit of joy I have left." Belle, as if sensing his sorrow, trotted back to his side, nudging his hand with her cold nose. Elias rested his hand on her small, soft head, his fingers brushing through the fur between her ears. "Don't you ever change?" he said quietly, feeling the sting of something he couldn't name. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was the fear of losing her. Belle didn't answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned against his leg, her bell ringing just a little louder, as if to say, "I'm here." "I'm here." Elias stood there for a long time, in the snow and the silence, with nothing but the soft ringing of Belle's bell and the promise of her unwavering companionship, though time continued to march on, and though the days seemed to blur. Together, Elias could never deny the truth that sat heavy on his heart. Belle had become his lifeline. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring back his family, his farm, his youth. But for every cold, empty night that he spent alone, there was Belle steady and constant, her little bell ringing in the silence, and that for now was enough. The autumn days had come early that year, and with them a biting chill that would linger in the air long after the harvest was finished. The trees on the hillside had already begun to shed their leaves, leaving the branches bare and brittle. The once vibrant fields that Elias had worked so hard to till now sat empty, their soil a mute reminder of the life that used to fill them. But amidst the stillness of the farm, there was still a rhythm, a pulse, one that kept Elias moving through. The days, it was the soft patter of Belle's hooves on the gravel path, the faint jingle of her silver bell echoing in the quiet that anchored him. Every morning they would go for a walk together, sometimes along the fence line, sometimes to the well, sometimes to the far corner of the farm, but always with the same slow, steady pace. This morning, like many others, Elias felt the weight of his bones aching. He was no longer the strong, vigorous man who had built this farm from nothing. The years had carved deep lines into his face, and his hands trembled more than they used to. Still, he was out here, taking his usual walk with Belle by his side. She was still young, and her steps were quick and light, as if time moved differently for her than it did for him. They reached the hill that Elias had climbed so many times before, the one that overlooked the entire valley. From this high vantage point you could see the distant city where his daughter Lucy now lived. You could see the village with its crooked rooftops and winding streets. You could see the forest that stretched like a green sea toward the mountains. In the distance, but more than any of that, Elias came here for the memories. He sat down on the same weathered stone he had sat on for years, the stone that had become a kind of quiet marker of his life, a place where he could reflect on everything he had lost. Belle trotted up beside him, stopping at his side, her little bell chiming softly as she lowered her head to graze on the sparse grass around them. Elias leaned back, his body creaking with the effort, and gazed out over the valley, the cool autumn breeze tugging at his coat. For a long time he said nothing. The silence between him and Belle felt natural, as it always did, comfortable, even in its heaviness. It was a kind of peace that didn't require words. "I used to bring her here," Elias murmured to Belle, his voice thick with the weight of memory. He didn't know if Belle understood, but somehow he knew she was listening. Lucy, she loved this spot. I'd tell her stories about the land, about the mountains in the distance, and she'd laugh like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. Belle tilted her head up at him, her dark eyes full of an understanding that moved Elias. More than he cared to admit. I thought she would stay, Elias said, his voice trailing off. The words were hard to get out, as if they carried the weight of years with them. But life has a way of pulling people away, doesn't it? The wind picked up, rustling, the remaining leaves on the branches above them, and Elias shut his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the valley wash over him. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of birdsong, and beneath that, the sound of Belle's gentle chewing as she grazed nearby. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope, one that had been sitting there for weeks, untouched. He held it up for a moment, as if considering what to do with it. The letter was addressed to Lucy, written with the hope that maybe this time she would come. This time she would read it and hear the call of home. The letter spoke of his loneliness, of how the farm was growing quiet, of how much he missed her, but somehow it had always remained in his coat pocket, unsent, never reaching her. I wrote to her again, Elias whispered, his thumb tracing the edge of the envelope. I tell her things, you know. Things I should have said a long time ago. Belle, ever the attentive listener, stopped grazing and turned toward him. Standing still as if to wait for him to finish, he let out a slow breath, eyes still locked on the letter. But I don't think she come. I think she's forgotten about this place, forgotten about me. The wind tugged at his coat as he sat there, a tired old man staring out over a life that felt far behind him. His eyes wandered over the landscape, but his thoughts were on the past, on the house he had built with his wife, on the days when the farm had been full of life and laughter, on the days when he wasn't so alone. Belle let out a soft bleat, as if trying to comfort him, and Elias felt his heart tighten. I've been thinking, Belle, he said, his voice soft. When I'm gone, I want you to keep coming up here. This hill, this spot, it's special. It's where I've spent my life, and I want it to be yours too. You'll watch over this place for me, won't you? Belle didn't answer, but her soft bleat and her steady presence were enough. He smiled, a sad but genuine smile. I know you will. You've been the best company I've had in years. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the valley, and Elias stood slowly, brushing the dirt and dust from his coat. Belle trotted up beside him, and the two of them walked back toward the house, side by side, the evening settling in around them as they made their way down the hill. Elias looked back one last time at the place that had held so many memories, both good and bad. He didn't know how much time he had left, whether it would be months or years, but he did know one thing for certain. As long as Belle was with him, he wouldn't have to face it alone, and that, in the quiet loneliness of the evening, felt like enough. The first frost of winter arrived quietly, a thin veil of ice covering the fields like a secret, whispered between the trees. The nights were growing longer, and the mornings colder. Elias could feel the weight of the season settling into his bones. He woke early, as he always did, but it wasn't the usual steady energy that greeted him. Instead, he found himself aching as he climbed out of bed, his legs stiff, his joints groaning in protest. The fire in the hearth had gone out, and the chill of the house wrapped around him like an unwanted cloak. Belle was already by the door when he shuffled into the kitchen, her soft, dark eyes watching him with the patience he had come to expect. She was waiting, as she always did, for the day to begin. Elias smiled weakly at her, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, Belle," he muttered, his voice cracked with the dryness of the cold air. "Another day, another morning." Belle responded with a gentle bleat, but she didn't move from her place by the door. The silence in the house seemed heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves could feel the weight of time passing by for the past few months. Elias had felt the years pressing in on him more than ever. It wasn't just his aches and pains, though. They were growing more frequent. It was a deeper weariness, a heaviness in his chest that wouldn't leave. His heart was tired, and his mind even more so. There were mornings when he woke up and couldn't remember how many days had passed since his last true moment of peace. But Belle Belle was always there. With a deep sigh, Elias went to the hearth and stoked the embers, coaxing the fire back to life. Belle stood at his feet, watching him intently, the soft jingle of her bell the only sound in the otherwise quiet house. As the fire crackled and the warmth spread through the room, Elias finally felt some of the tightness in his chest loosen. He turned to Belle and gave her a small, rueful smile. "You've been good to me, haven't you?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I've forgotten what it's like to be truly alone with you around." Belle let out a soft bleat, nuzzling his leg in that comforting, familiar way she always did. She was his companion, his only companion, and in her quiet, gentle way. She had kept him tethered to the world when it would have been easy to let go, but that morning something felt different. The weight on his chest didn't lift. The cold in the room seemed to cling to him, as if it had come to stay. By the time the sun had risen higher in the sky, Elias had finished his chores, but everything felt slow, too slow. The simple tasks he had once done with ease now left him winded. Even walking to the barn, which had once been a brisk and effortless activity, now felt like a journey. Belle followed him to the barn, as always, her little bell jingling softly with each step. Elias tried to keep a steady pace, but his legs were stiff, his breath labored. When they reached the barn door, he paused for a moment, steadying himself against the wooden frame. "Maybe we should rest today, Belle," he said softly. "Maybe, ... Maybe I'm not up for it, not today." Belle nudged his hand as though she understood. She always did, but as the hours passed and the sky turned dark again, Elias felt the weight of his fatigue more keenly than ever. His eyes were heavy, his limbs slow and unresponsive. He sat down by the fire, watching Belle curl up beside him as she always did. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire seep into his bones, and drifted in and out of a half-dash sleep. It was in that half-dream state that Elias felt something strange, a stillness that lingered around him, like a quiet, unspoken presence. He opened his eyes, the firelight flickering in the darkened room. For a moment he felt a deep, aching loneliness, a loneliness that was different from what he'd known before. It was the loneliness that came with understanding that time was running out. The truth settled in, cold and sharp, like a piece of ice lodged in his chest. He was not going to be here forever. He looked down at Belle, who was resting by his feet. Her bell had stopped ringing, and she lay still, her body curled into a small, serene ball of white fur. Her soft breathing was the only sound in the room. A thought crossed his mind, unbidden and heavy with sorrow. What would happen to her when I'm gone? He had never truly thought about it before. He had been too focused on his own survival, on getting through the days. But the thought of leaving Belle behind, of her being alone in this silent, empty house without him, was unbearable. "I wish I could promise you something," Elias murmured, his voice rough. "I wish I could promise you everything would be okay. That you wouldn't be alone." Belle raised her head at the sound of his voice, her dark eyes meeting his, full of that quiet understanding that always made Elias feel as though she saw something he couldn't. She reached out with her nose, touching his hand gently, offering comfort in her simple, unspoken way. Elias smiled, a tear slipping from his eye before he could stop it. It was the first one in weeks. "You've already given me everything, Belle," he said softly, stroking her fur. "Everything I could ever ask for." The fire crackled and hissed as the minutes ticked by, and Elias finally felt his exhaustion pulling him deeper into sleep. Belle stayed by his side, never straying, her little bell now silent in the stillness of the night. As he drifted off, the last thought in his mind was of Belle, of how she had been with him through it all. And somehow that thought gave him a strange sense of peace, like the quiet echo of a life well lived. The next morning, when the sun came up and the world outside was as still and frozen as the night before, Belle waited by the door, as she always did, but Elias didn't come. The house felt emptier than ever in the days that followed. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, and the silence was deeper, more profound than it had ever been before. The valley, once filled with the sounds of animals and laughter, had grown still. Even the wind seemed to have quieted, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Belle wandered the house now, her steps slower, more measured. She had always been by Elias's side, but now there was a quiet uncertainty in her movements. She would stand by the door, waiting, but no one would open it for her. She would walk the paths they had once traveled together, but now they seemed too vast, too lonely, without him beside her. The first few days were the hardest. She would lie by the hearth, her head resting on the stone floor, her bell still jingling. Occasionally, though the sound was faint like an echo of something lost, the house felt colder without Elias's presence, and the memories of their time together clung to every corner. Heavy with grief, it wasn't until the third day that Belle ventured to the hilltop, the place where Elias had always gone to reflect, to remember, and to dream. The path was familiar to her, and the wind had a cold bite to it that nipped at her fur, but she didn't hesitate. She had been here before, many times, always following Elias's slow steps up the hill. But this time she was alone. At the top, the valley stretched out before her, bathed in the soft light of the late afternoon sun. The trees had lost their leaves, the fields lay bare, and the mountains in the distance stood silent, their peaks dusted with the first signs of winter's snow. Belle stood there for a long time, her small frame a pale figure against the vastness of the landscape, the bell around her neck the only sound in the quiet world. The memories came in waves. Elias's voice calling to her, the warmth of his hand on her back, the way he would talk to her like she understood everything he said. It was as though she could still feel his presence, as though he had never really gone. But Belle understood the truth. She wandered to the stone where Elias had always sat, the one that had become a symbol of his quiet reflection. She sat there, now her eyes fixed on the horizon. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the land, and for the first time in days, Belle let out a soft, mournful bleat. It was a sound of sorrow, of longing, of a bond that had been severed but would never be broken. As the light faded, Belle remained on the hill, watching the valley below, waiting for something, though she knew not what. The stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. It was as if the whole world had paused, giving her this moment to remember, to reflect. The days that followed were filled with a quiet mourning, a gentle passing of time that seemed to stretch on forever. Belle continued to wander the farm, doing what she had always done, eating the grass, finding shelter from the cold, following the familiar paths. But there was something different now. The house, once a home full of life, had become a place of memory, and Belle was the only one left to remember. But as the days passed into weeks, something began to shift. Belle had always known this land, this place, but now it felt like she was carrying it all with her. The weight of Elias's absence didn't stop her from living, but it made her walk with a certain slowness, a certain tenderness, as though each step held the memory of something precious. One cold morning, Belle went to the barn, something she hadn't done in a long time. She had avoided it, unable to face the empty stalls and the quiet, lifeless space that had once echoed with the sound of hooves and bleats. But today, as she entered the barn, something felt different. The air smelled of hay and dust, but there was no longer the heavy weight of emptiness. It was a place of memories now, a place where Elias's presence still lingered like a soft warmth in the corners of the barn. Belle moved to the far corner, where Elias had kept his tools. She nudged a shovel with her nose, her bell giving a faint jingle in the quiet barn. She sniffed the ground, her hooves brushing against the old straw. And then, for the first time in days, she let out another soft bleat. It was quieter this time, softer, as if she had come to terms with the absence of the man who had been her world. After a moment, Belle turned and walked out of the barn, her head held high. The weight of grief was still with her, but it was no longer the thing that defined her. Elias had given her everything he had in his final years, his companionship, his love, his presence, and now it was her turn to carry that forward, to continue the rhythm of life even without him. She walked out into the fields, past the fence line where the grass swayed gently in the breeze. The horizon stretched out before her, endless and wide. The valley was still, the mountains in the distance wrapped in the soft glow of the setting sun. Belle lifted her head to the sky, the bell around her neck ringing once. A solitary sound that seemed to fill the space around her. Elias was gone, but she would keep the memories alive. She would walk these paths for him, and when the time came, she would pass the stories of the farm, of the land, of the life they had shared, onto the world that would follow. For now, Belle was the keeper of their story, the last of their love. And she would carry it with her, always. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and Belle stood alone in the field, the fading light casting a long shadow behind her. But as the darkness crept in, she felt a strange peace settle in her heart. The last bell rang softly in the night.